Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. Thank you for joining us. Following a wave of criticism from both Democrats and Republicans, President Trump says he has canceled plans to host next year's G7 summit at his resort in Doral, Florida. The reversal comes after acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney on Thursday brushed off questions over whether the president was using his office to enrich himself.
Listen, I was skeptical. I was aware of the political sort of criticism that we'd come under for doing it at Doral, which is why I was so surprised when the advance team called back and said that this was the perfect physical location to do this. So I get the criticisms. So does he. Face it, he'd be criticized regardless of what he chose to do. But no, there's no issue here on him profiting from this in any way, shape, or form.
But by late Saturday night, the president tweeted, "Based on both media and Democrat crazed and irrational hostility, we will no longer consider Trump National Doral, Miami as the host site for the G7 in 2020. We will begin the search for another site, including the possibility of Camp David, immediately." Sean Sullivan is a national political reporter for the Washington Post and CBSN political contributor. He joins me now from Washington. All right, Sean, so why was the president's original decision to host the G7 summit at his resort in Doral a problem for lawmakers?
Well, it was a problem not just for Democratic lawmakers, but we also heard concerns from Republicans, which is notable given that, for the most part, we have seen Republican lawmakers stand by this president in controversy after controversy. But what we heard was alarm and concern, again, from both parties about this decision to host this event at a Trump property, no less, as my colleagues have reported, that has struggled financially. There are concerns about conflicts of interest, concerns about potentially trying to enrich himself through, hosting this event there. A very dangerous intersection between government work and private sector business work for Trump. That was the problem that a lot of lawmakers saw. But this reversal, which came late last night, is quite extraordinary. I mean, we usually see President Trump stand by his decisions, even when Republican and Democratic lawmakers criticize him. But this was one of those instances where we did see a pretty swift and sudden outcry from both parties. And so it looks like that sort of took a political toll on this president. He's reversed this decision. But again, it's notable because he doesn't tend to back away from these decisions, even when he's facing criticism from Congress.
Absolutely. I want to turn to another issue. In a White House press briefing Thursday, Mick Mulvaney spoke about a topic that's at the heart of the impeachment inquiry against the president, the decision to withhold U.S. military aid money from Ukraine. Let's listen to some of that.
Those were the driving factors. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money. Well, McKinney said yesterday that he was really upset with the political influence in foreign policy. That was one of the reasons he was so upset about this. And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy.
So, Sean, those comments from Mick Mulvaney, which he then later tried to walk back, those initial comments really seemed to contradict the message that we had been hearing from the White House, that there was no quid pro quo. How did that go over at the White House?
Well, I think first off, across the board, I think it was an astonishing remark and then reversal for both Republicans and Democrats to hear that. Publicly, the White House has not really said, that they are concerned about these comments, that they have taken issue with them. But my colleagues do have some reporting at the Post about behind the scenes concerns about how this looked. Right now, the White House is in a position where they're facing a barrage of questions constantly as this impeachment inquiry moves forward. And when you have to reverse yourself, when you have to go back and clarify what you're saying on something as substantive and significant as what Mulvaney was talking about, it always raises questions about what President Trump is going to think, because he does, we know, watch the news coverage. He does see and pay attention to how his aides are portrayed and how they're being covered in the news. So behind the scenes, it appears that there is some concern about Mulvaney's remarks. The question is, where does that lead? Does President Trump begin to, get more worried about his performance in his job? Because ultimately, he's the decider, and he's the one who decides, who stays and who goes. And we've seen over the past couple of years a lot of turnover in this White House at the high levels, in the chief of staff job, and in other senior positions. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on Mick Mulvaney right now, and also what the president thinks about him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, keeping with the impeachment investigation, there were a number of closed-door hearings this past week. The president's former Russia advisor, Fiona Hill, and the ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, both testified to Congress. What were the big takeaways from those?
Well, the big takeaways from the testimony from the two of them is the extent to which they talked about Rudy Giuliani, who is the president's personal attorney, and the extent to which they said he was involved in foreign policy dealings with Ukraine, which is sort of an extraordinary revelation to hear these people say that. So what it did was cast more of a spotlight on Giuliani, more questions being raised about what his role was in the situation with regard to Ukraine, and it's going to lead to more questions in the coming weeks as this impeachment inquiry moves forward about what role he played.
Well, House Democrats are moving rapidly with this impeachment inquiry. Sean, is there any indication of when we might see a vote in the House?
Well, we don't really know yet, but the timeline that we're hearing both Republicans and Democrats talk about is the end of the year. And there are reasons on both sides politically that both of these parties want to move forward with this quickly. I mean, on the Democratic side, you've got an election year coming up. You've got a presidential campaign and a primary that's unfolding right now. And so if you run into that, it definitely complicates things. And then when you look at the Republicans, they also look at this situation and they don't necessarily want this to drag on for months and months and months. They want to move past this. Senate Republicans are confident that, look, if the House does go ahead and impeach President Trump, and then there is a trial in the Senate, they're confident that they have the numbers and they have the votes to prevent the president from being convicted. But they want to do that quickly. So if you're looking at a potential sort of rough timeline right now, I would keep an eye on Christmas and New Year's as the timeline on which we might see a vote in the House. We might even see a trial in the Senate before that time, because there is, again, incentive in both of these parties to get much of this wrapped up before we head into 2020.
Just in time for the holidays. All right, Sean. So switching gears now, I want to ask about former Vice President Joe Biden. His campaign has been plagued by questions over his son's work for a Ukrainian energy company. A senior State Department official told Congress he raised concerns about Hunter Biden back in 2015. What did we learn from that testimony, and how is it affecting Joe Biden's campaign?
Well, what I hear from a lot of Democrats who look at this situation is that they say a couple of things. One, that certainly, and we've seen this, in all of these news reports, there has not been any evidence of any wrongdoing by Joe Biden or Hunter Biden. But that said, this continues to be a political problem for him. And what Democrats have told me is, for your average Democratic voter who looks at this situation and is not paying attention to every single detail, they might have questions and say to themselves, why was the vice president's son sitting on this board? What was he actually doing? Was there any impropriety here? And what it also does is it distracts from what Joe Biden wants to talk about. He wants to have a conversation about health care, the economy, and why he can beat President Trump. But as we saw in last Tuesday's debate, he's getting questions about Hunter Biden. He's getting questions about his role as vice president. These questions are going to continue to follow him, and they haven't shown any signs of easing up. So even though there's no evidence of wrongdoing politically, this continues to be a challenge for Joe Biden, and something that Democrats are worried in some quarters that he'll be able to get past and move beyond.
Well, keeping with the 2020 presidential race, the fourth Democratic debate was in Westerville, Ohio, Tuesday. There were a dozen candidates on stage. Sean, are there indications from voters or donors about who they think gave the strongest performance?
Well, we've seen a few initial signs about who might have some momentum coming out of this debate. The real test will be in the next 4 or 5 days when we see public polling that will give us a more definitive picture of who did well. But a few names to watch. One is Amy Klobuchar, who was more aggressive in this debate than she has been in the past. Her campaign announced that she had raised more than $1 million in the 24 hours after the debate. So some financial momentum there. Pete Buttigieg is another one to keep an eye on. He drew a pretty sharp contrast with Elizabeth Warren on health care. He was someone who had been sort of rising a little bit in the polls of late. We'll see whether that continues or not. Another one to watch is Senator Bernie Sanders, who came into the debate after a long absence. He had suffered a heart attack. He was off the campaign trail. The reviews were pretty positive for Senator Sanders. And then he got some pretty high-profile endorsements, a really, really big crowd in New York yesterday. The question there is, does that mean and does that translate to support in the polls? Because he's been lagging behind Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden. So the question for Sanders is, can he move up from sort of that third place position that he's been in to a second place, or at least competing for second place? And then the last person to watch is Senator Warren, because she went into this debate as a big target, but she has continued to show strength in the polls. She's continued to grow in the polls. She's leading Joe Biden in some recent polls. Can she maintain that, or do the attacks that she faced in the debate diminish her standing? So that's what we should watch in the coming days as we look at these polls.
I want to ask you more about Senator Sanders in just a moment, but let's talk about Senator Kamala Harris. Her campaign started off strong, but a new Emerson poll out of Iowa shows her polling at just 2% support with Democratic caucus voters. Sean, what have the trend lines shown with her campaign over the course of the Democratic primary contest here? You know, from the time that we saw that moment, for instance, where she very forcefully went after Joe Biden up until this point.
Yeah, it's been a real roller coaster for Senator Harris. When she launched her campaign earlier this year, she drew a massive crowd. She was seen in the party as somebody who might be a leading candidate, or if not the leading candidate in this race. And then for a while, she struggled to gain traction. But as you mentioned, Elaine, she did have a big moment in a debate earlier this year where she challenged former Vice President Biden directly. But then after that, she struggled. She didn't use that momentum effectively, or wasn't able to use it to translate into support in some of these early state polls. And we've seen her support erode pretty consistently across the board nationally and in these early states. And the problem for her and the challenge she faces right now is one that a lot of candidates are facing, is that, with so many candidates, so many Democrats running for president, it's hard to build a rock-solid base of support that is going to be with you through thick and thin, that is going to support you in these early states. And it looks like she, like a lot of candidates, hasn't really built that base of support yet. And it's not really clear what her path to victory would be through these primaries. It looks like she's focusing a lot on Iowa right now. But again, not having that base of support and having this sort of roller coaster trajectory over the past few months has been a challenge for Senator Harris.
Speaking of base of support, back on Senator Sanders for just a moment before I let you go. So he got that endorsement from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Is that gain Senator Elizabeth Warren's loss in terms of endorsements?
Well, it's certainly a significant endorsement, and we saw it. I was in New York yesterday where the two of them appeared together. Senator Sanders, according to his campaign, drew a crowd of more than 25,000 people, and that would be the largest crowd of any campaign event that a Democrat has held this entire year. So it's no doubt something that the Sanders campaign feels is a really, really big moment for them, especially as they're trying to sort of regain their footing coming out of a 2-week period where Senator Sanders was off the trail. And yes, there were many Democrats that I talked to who thought, she might endorse Senator Warren, or she might stay neutral in this primary, given especially the fact that Warren has been doing so well in the polls, that she has a lot of momentum. But this is something that Sanders' allies hope will help them as they sort of, look to rebound and sort of come back from what's been basically the toughest stretch of Senator Sanders' campaign. We'll see whether it actually leads to greater support, whether it actually leads to more attention, whether it helps Senator Sanders build his base, which is loyal, but it's pretty limited right now. So definitely keep an eye on how the Sanders campaign moves forward, where we see Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez campaigning for Senator Sanders, and whether she can build more support for him, whether she can build, bridges to people who are skeptical of Senator Sanders or not.
All right, we'll be watching closely. Sean Sullivan in Washington for us. Sean, always great to have you. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine.